Hello, welcome to our webinar, Why IoT Security Matters for Modern Enterprises, brought to you by Optiv, the Cyber Advisory and Solutions Leader. I'm Dave Gauss, Security Advisor at Optiv, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So first of all, thank you very much for joining. Today we're going to be discussing how the security landscape for enterprises is rapidly evolving and becoming increasingly complex. With more connected IoT devices than ever, how can you be sure that your employees, data, and networks are truly protected? Our experts will be sharing why IoT security should be top priority for every modern organization, while breaking down the growing risks and sharing actionable strategies to strengthen your IoT defense posture. Speaking of experts, joining me today, we have Sean Tufts, Managing Partner at Optiv, and Scott Starling, Security Advisor here at Optiv. So thank you very much for joining us today. So to kick things off, let's talk about which IoT devices are considered important when it comes to vulnerabilities. Like, what types of devices are threat actors targeting to infiltrate both personal and enterprise environments? Sean?
Yeah, it's funny, when we kicked off this idea, I'm going to pick on Brittany, who's been organizing all this for us in the back end. The first question I asked is, what do you mean by IoT? Because there's such a wide spectrum of devices and opportunities, and what's the difference between OT, between industrial IoT, between a drone with a chainsaw cutting trees over a power line, right? These are all, and then comparing that to like a simple Peloton or a smart fridge, which is kind of all the rage from a couple of years ago. So I think from an IoT perspective, the things that I think about when we start defining what is IoT is it's got to go through, if it's going to be kind of wrapped in the security blanket, it's got to go through two places. Number one, business criticality. It's got to be something that the business actually cares about, right? And can't just knock offline with a knack or something like that, right? So like Pelotons in that world probably falls out the bottom just from a criticality perspective, because it's got to have some business data and other things. I think the other piece that's really important is, does it have Windows or Linux? If it doesn't, and it's got some homegrown, crazy, weird interface that has an app and is Wi-Fi connected and things like that, then I start to put it in the IoT bucket, because we can't use our big EDRs. We don't really know what the devices are from asset inventory tools. So those are the kind of things we look at. I think the other big piece that we look at is what industries are we supporting? So one of the things we did at that same moment was go look at our internal structures and what our data relevance is showing us. So we have a bunch of really cool data in our systems where, number one, we can look at what trends are, what things are moving. We can look at historical data. We can look at buying patterns. We can look at industry cuts. And that's what we've pulled here. So market relevance and the signals that our business analytics teams look at from an IoT perspective fall under these verticals. This is really fascinating data for me professionally. I spend a lot of my time in critical infrastructure world, so we always think about oil and gas, electric, and manufacturing. This is showing that actually the market relevance for IoT is actually swaying heavily towards one vertical, and that's finance, which is really unexpected. The electric utilities and things kind of downstream of that have handled a lot of their IIoT needs, their industrial needs. They've started that process. So from a relevance perspective, we're seeing finance and professional service rocket to the top, which actually is really interesting to me. So Dave, when you asked earlier, what are we thinking about from an actual device? That leads me down a path of, number one, physical security and making sure our cameras, our badge readers, all those IoT devices. Number two, the retail banking side also perks up, where we have a lot of physical carpeted areas where there's a mix of corporate employees and guests of the company, and merging those two things together. That's probably also why we see things like educational services and wholesale trade in this top end of this look. The one that's up there that's interesting to me is healthcare. Healthcare has been moving in a really big direction for a couple years, but we're still seeing this IoT is very relevant for them. In a hospital, you've got one big tall building with hundreds of thousands of machines that are in some cases life critical. So in that criticality perspective, if it's touching a human, then that immediately bumps it up into the criticality index. The second piece there is that your threat actors are running around your facility at all times. You have 100,000 people going in and out of a hospital door every day. and they're connecting to IoT devices, that ramps it up on the criticality index. The other one I think is interesting in this is educational services. I've been surprised that universities have not been taking this subject more seriously, from dorms to on-site power plants to R&D centers where we're populating new and building new technologies that other foreign entities really, really want to have. You can think in the universities in the North Bay area, you can think of anything in Massachusetts, right? Those are critical edge stuff. And a lot of them are being built on the back end of new fancy technologies that don't have a Windows operating system. And they are kind of operating hanging off the grid. So those are what we think of when we think of criticality, when we think of a vertical perspective. I think the other piece that's really interesting that we were able to pull that was just kind of sitting next to it was, what tooling do we see that people are knocking these devices out and actually controlling and securing the base of IoT devices? I kind of cut this into two worlds. The top half of this chart is our known platforms. And you can see 20% of companies, and from a relevance perspective, people are starting to go down the path of extending their firewalls, extending their EDR platforms to start to approach that IoT device, pushing it out of the data centers, off the corporate issued machines, and into this new IoT sphere. I think the other piece that's really interesting is the growth of CPS tools. Gartner categorized that starting CPS, which is cyber physical systems, starting that category about 3 years ago. We've seen a big growth in the Clarities, the Nozomis, the Dragoses of the world, the Armises, where they're starting to take hold and codify and actually get good asset inventory on these machines. So those are how clients are currently prospected to start to handle and actually start to protect these IoT devices.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. That was very enlightening. And as far as security as a whole, what types of issues would we expect out of IoT devices? Like what kinds of ways does IoT actually cause us problems?
I think from the start, it causes a problem by coming in through the side door. Most organizations, and even the most mature, have a new feature request, a group in IT that's in charge of vetting new technologies as they come in. That world is usually pretty guarded and well walled, right? IoT devices usually come in the side door. There's usually a mission criticality that someone is coming forth and saying, we need this functionality and we need it right now. We would see that heavily in university environments, like I talked. We'd see that heavily in hospital environments, like I talked about. So more of those devices are coming in from the outside, getting plopped on the network, getting routed through our networking infrastructure. And because they don't have Windows or Linux, they're hidden. We don't see the MAC address. We don't see the make, model, and serial number. So we start losing those devices in the shuffle, and they just get populated into an asset inventory bucket of unknown. About 3 months ago, we were at a state capitol, and we were sitting in their SOC. It was amazing because we did an asset inventory look, and we took a technology that was a lot better at seeing asset inventory on IoT devices, and we blanketed literally the entire state with it in about 45 minutes and pulled back a bunch of new asset inventory we didn't know they had. We're sitting there and the SOC manager calls up the Department of Corrections and said, hey, we don't have any Hikvision or any of the other known Chinese cameras in our system, do we? And he said, no, we definitely don't have any of those. He said, then why am I looking at Hikvision in the prison yard? And he could see all the cameras because we got better clarity on what these IoT devices were in a couple minutes. So someone at that prison had gone to Walmart or wherever and bought a low-cost camera, plugged it right in, and we were unable to see it. But now with new technologies, we're starting to be able to get better asset inventory and actually identify these solutions, which has been a really great growth area for us.
I'll just underhand this one right back to you. So it is not unusual to discover way more assets than people thought they had.
Absolutely. Every time we turn around, there's more and more devices coming onto our corporate networks. And it's just been an absolute, especially in the last couple of years, as digital transformation, as zero trust, as all these cloud connectivity things have started, it started to really pour into more and more and more and more devices.
It makes it easy for rogue devices to pop up on the network and go unnoticed.
Yeah, we see that all the time. It's just every day. And then for every 100, there's one that you should probably knock out. I think that leads to, and Scott, you might have had a lot of good experiences on third-party pieces and really looking at those devices. Scott, do you want to share your experience on that?
Yeah, well, I would just say, from a holistic view, I think, and historically speaking, these manufacturers aren't really security minded in terms of, they don't do things with a secure by design mindset. They're not focused on confidentiality, integrity, availability. And then when they do design sensors or IoT devices with security in mind, organizations don't tend to have the budgets to purchase or procure those with those specific security features. So, I think it's from a holistic perspective, in this kind of where Sean's going with the third party perspective, right? We have to kind of remember that IoT devices are still computing devices and they're governed by the same rules, the protocols, capabilities, right? Just as that's in the data center. So it really boils down to the amount of due care and due diligence that's going to really define our success or our failure, right? So I think a lot of the risk occurs because these operating systems, the protocols that these IoT devices use to kind of compute and communicate, they're really never designed to see the light of internet. And they were instead designed to operate on closed networks, right? But now we're pushing all that data through, these analysis and the analytics and the value that we can derive from placing sensors of IoT devices into the various environments, right? So some of the security challenges, I think, leading into that is absolutely third-party risk management. Not just the devices that are on your network, but any network that those devices communicate with. So it's really important to understand and get visibility into the third-party devices that are touching your network. It's really important to understand their supply chain in terms of, how serious do they take security and what vulnerabilities and what risk are they introducing into your environment. So, IoT security challenges as a whole, like even without that, right? It's the interfaces and the apps that we use to interface with the sensors, the IoT devices, they're vulnerable. There's physical security risk. These devices tend to be set and forget. So, we really, don't realize that a lot of these devices have memory. It could be proprietary information. It could be sensitive information that could be captured just by, USB port or pulling the SD card out. The vendors don't support them. I think there's interoperability issues that are very difficult to patch, right? And then the credentials, whether it's the admin credentials, they're hard-coded, right? Not only are they hard-coded, they tend to be weak. So I think from a holistic market-wide perspective, that's some of the challenges that we see when it comes to, securing IoT.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about what enterprises are doing, but we're not talking about the device makers, right? And and the one biggest example of that in the last 10 or 15 years or so has been the pager hack last year, where 3,000 pagers blew up in people's pockets, and that was a straight third-party risk. Someone didn't vet where they bought a bunch of pagers from, and then that was an incredibly mature device hacking. But we see even from device makers large and small, and Scott, you make a really good point around SDLC processes, right? Security built into a product is expensive, and it can make the product more viable. And obviously, people will not buy a product because it is insecure. But most often, that's a 10th or 15th category in a big RFP, right? So we're seeing even the big global brands are having trouble building security into the front end of their product, let alone two guys in Alabama with a truck that are fabricating stuff together now put Wi-Fi into it, right? That's been a big growth. And I think that, Scott, that piece that you hit on with SDLC processes is critically important. And we've seen a lot of clients go to the mattresses and really push their third parties through a lot more diligence on how are you building this tool? What is it built for? Do we have the simple things that like CISA and everyone else is recommending? Simple things like password flips, right? Mandating that those credentials roll before they're deployed. That's a simple one that just doesn't get done all that often. So we're seeing a lot of those controls and power in the buyer help to push those SDLC processes forward. I think when we talk with device makers, all of them have this opinion that cybersecurity won't win you a bid, but it could definitely lose you one. And not having those right answers and those right best practices built in the products has really been knocking people out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that I would have answered that question in a very similar way in the first question that Dave asked, right? Is, really it depends on the network. It depends on the vertical in terms of what's important, right? Because really everything in the IoT ecosystem, is an attack surface. And so what's connected to the crown jewels, if a system was to be, a vulnerability on a system was to be exploited, what kind of impact would that have for your organization, right? And so there is, in a lot of industries where you traditionally may have seen air gaps, it's because of IoT that those air gaps were being eroded, right? Because there's so much value that's derived from placing sensors to try to understand the health of equipment or gather, information. When you've got, like in industrial IoT, for example, right? When you've got a very high, or medical, right? You've got a high emphasis on uptime, safety, resilience. Those insights can be extremely valuable in accomplishing those goals, right? And, IoT platforms give you the ability to not just get information and data gathered, collected, and analyzed on a single system, but multiple systems and multiple sites. So it makes it very easy, right? Easier, right? To reach your goals of uptime, safety, and resilience.
Which is funny because we do all that work on critical systems that are touching safety systems. And then the thermometer on a fish tank in Vegas blops out a huge casino, right? We're doing all that work on the critical systems, and then something in the back door just totally takes advantage of us. And that's why I think if we can blend those SDLC programs in with better asset inventory, that's like a really good maturity process to start to learn what we even have.
I agree 100%. It's a double-edged sword, right? Because, you're deriving a lot of value from the information and insights gained, right? But you're also introducing a lot of risk into the environment that can actually be detrimental to the things that you're trying to uphold and get more insights into, like safety, resiliency, and uptime, right? So, some key thoughts there. That was good stuff. Good comments on bringing that back together. So,
Scott, how does we know that devices can connect, definitely Wi-Fi, we've mentioned that, and physically else we talked about physical plug like Ethernet, what have you. How does 5G fit into all of this? What does 5G mean, and cellular in general, mean for IoT? Did it change it at all? Should we be worried about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at a high level, and to kind of keep this simple, right? Because 5G can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So for us in a security role, right? It just really expands the use cases. It expands the connectivity options. So it's going to expand the different types of endpoints that we see, right? So with like 5G, you already had really, really fast throughput with 4G, LTE advanced type of connection. So 5G, you're bringing the computing, the processing capabilities closer to where the connection is, like closer to the tower. And so basically what that does is reduces latency, right? I'm from the 1900s, so I can use this example of like a VCR to kind of explain latency, right? By the time you press play, and by the time the mechanisms, you kind of hear them, right, start to churn a little bit, and then all of a sudden the video plays, right? Well, that kind of explains latency, right? The difference from the time you press play to the time the action happens. Well, that's greatly reduced with 5G because of edge computing. And so it spurns the reality for all of us to have autonomous vehicles and other smart connections that require low latency. VR headsets, for example, things like that.
Scott, you know where I see this the most? Airports.
Oh,
airports. Yeah. Every time I'm walking in an airport, and anyone can do this, as you're walking down the concourse, look at all the vending machines. Almost every single vending machine and people selling, from AirPods to state lotteries, they have an Ethernet cord into the wall, but then they also have a little cell antenna sticking out of the top. They've built 5G functionality into that vending machine kiosk because we want to know when the Snickers are out. And we want to know, what's happening. But we've also just dual hung that device. So if the airport's not really careful, they've just put a bunch of systems onto an internet through that one kiosk, through that one cell antenna. And those 5G networks are really, really powerful now, especially in more critical industries like pipelines and things like that. So I think you're right, Scott. The more that we've had that functionality, the faster it's turned into a security risk. And I don't think anyone's really prepared for that full scope of 5G and the new capabilities. And as we digitally transform, the more security risks we build in, which is pretty risky.
Right, and it gives further validity to using cellular networks for backup and recovery. In the case of a disaster should strike, there's different routers that have 5G connectivity. There's SD-WAN and other things like that you can bring to bear. I think not to get too in the weeds there, but I think what kind of limits that is the cost perspective of each SIM card, right? Because those things tend to be on a metered versus unlimited basis, and I think that can kind of limit in some cases. So they tend to be used in like an SD-WAN perspective or backup and recovery perspective. To get the network back up and running, it tends to be on a case by case, like a disaster-based perspective.
Now watch, what's going to happen here is Dave's going to be in an airport and unplug a machine from a wall, and then he's going to pull that Ethernet cord and then get arrested. So Dave, don't take that too literally.
You know me well.
Yeah, I do.
This is just a test. So we do have some Q&A, so let's try and at least just put out there, what is Optiv's approach to IoT security? How do we help organizations reduce the risk and ensure that data, network, and employees that are protected?
From my seat, I see a 1-2 punch. And the first one's governance and building in your processes, your procedures, the things you can partner with your procurement arms and really put forth intelligent ways to, number one, buy devices and have security on the front end of that. And then number two, once we get them, what are we doing with them, right? There has to be a program that asset inventory, for better or worse, has just not modernized with IoT at the same speed. So I think that governance build is first. So if we can help a client, and we've done some really impactful programs where we've taught people how to publicize their requirements during the procurement process, and then also how to build asset inventory programs. Both of those are a really good first step. The second piece to me is like that camera and that prison example, right? Tighter controls over asset inventory. The market has matured, so we're able to do stuff, to do inventory scans, to do active scanning on heavy infrastructure systems we have not been able to do before. If we just ran a scan on a vulnerability scan on a network, we could tip over a critical process. We've gotten smarter. So we've built programs to scan these devices that speak their native protocols, don't overrun those memories, and we can start to sweep those environments faster and faster. We had a hotel client where we scanned a lot of hotels very, very quickly in like seconds rather than 2 to 3 days. So we've improved that. So I think getting better and better around our asset inventory and working to build those programs is probably the next biggest item. You can't protect what you can't see. So if we can get a visibility to those devices, that's the first step in securing them.
Yeah, I would add to that, and maybe even take a step back and just say conceptually, it's very similar conceptually how we approach security in the enterprise world, just from a defense in depth based on zero trust concepts, right? So it's a layered approach. We don't trust and verify, and we assume breach, right? So from a security activities perspective, right, you're doing things to really block an attacker's ability to move laterally in the network. So just things like logging and monitoring, alerting, integrating those tools Sean was talking about into your SOC, writing playbooks, helps you better have to better have an IR response, incident response plan. Segmentation, I think, is really important. Access controls, both physical and logical, right? We can have all the greatest logical tools in the world, right? But if someone breaks in the room with a $5 wrench, and steals the asset, then all the tens of thousands that we spend on logical controls don't do us much good. But I do think it needs to be concentrated on like role-based access, things like that. But also like policy enforcement, right? Not just technical policy enforcement, but people and process policy.
The most impactful projects we've done, and Scott and I are in the tip of about 3 of them, are those re-architecting our networks. And a lot of that has to do with straight OT devices, so power plant controls, things like that. But the other half of it is really guiding on where these devices should sit in the network and opening up its own enclave to have IoT sitting there next to your guest network, next to your production networks. Scott and I have been we probably have 3 projects going now, and we've seen a big growth in network segmentation designs incorporating these heavy and new devices, which has been really fun.
Yeah, I would say too, just thinking on that, just kind of further, like in terms of what we can do to mitigate, these nodes, and I know we're running short of time, but these nodes really, these are clear text. IoT communicates in clear text, and so it's just really important to use encryption, and if you are able to do firmware upgrades, have a chain of trust for that. What is the source of that upgrade? And physical security, USB drive, USB access, changing defaults, no weak passwords, physically secure the device. And then going back to Sean's point, right? You've got to find the right tools to help you discover and understand the risk that's in the environment. And that's going to help you mitigate and detect it, and then eventually recover faster, if anything were to be exploited.
You just panicked me on unencrypted data in hospitals. That just made me panic a little bit inside. I don't want to see that.
Yeah. So I think, and my last comment too, and I'll just say this, and we can take questions maybe if we have time, but is that, those tools that you mentioned, Sean, are really going to give you that deep discovery. And that's going to help you, going back to the comments made about rogue devices, right? It's going to help you categorize and classify the devices so you know what, and you can kind of, each device is, but you can give each device an identity. And that helps you to understand even deeper the risk that's in that ecosystem, because if a device is acting outside of its behavioral norms from the identity that it's been given, right, then it's something that we can act on. And all of this ultimately feeds into your GRC, your governance, risk, and compliance efforts.
There's one question I wanted to hit on that is from the audience here. It says, for criticality concerns, is remote access a top priority from unmanaged devices? So what do we think about remote access in general, right?
Yeah, secure remote access is probably one of the bigger growth areas that I can forecast in the heavy industry world. We have, and Scott touched on third parties, right, and devices, but third party professional services. Most heavy industries have a fleet of third parties they rely to come in and tune a facility. Those people are coming in badged, typically corporate credentials, and they're logging in. We don't really know what they're doing. So giving people the ability to have the right vehicle to log into someone else's machines is really, really valuable. So if you want to take that a logical step forward, we've seen clients that have saved radical amounts of money on transportation because we're saving someone a trip to a site in North Dakota or to, a vessel that's moored 200 miles offshore, right? So having a secure remote access way to do that has been a lot better than our traditional team viewer or, whatever bastardized VPN we want to set up. So we've had a lot of different ways to do that, but none of them been centralized, coordinated, and built for the mission. So that's been a big growth area.
Yep, I agree with that.
Okay, well,
Great question.
Sean and Scott, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion today. I believe we are we're past time. So thank you all for joining us today for our Optiv webinar. Now, we do have more webinars scheduled, so do check in with our optiv.com website for more details on those. And one call out I would like to say is as we partner with our clients, if our clients aren't exactly sure what's going on, where they need to focus on next, we do offer workshops at no cost. So we have a technology landscape and also a program landscape that can take a look at everything that you're doing with the technology spin today, map it out into different verticals or domains of security. So you have an idea of what all is happening in your landscape, plus the program piece, which gives you a much deeper understanding of your entire environment and priorities that come out of that. So if you are interested in any of that, please reach out to your sales rep today. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.